All right, students, I want to talk about the major prophets. These are the books of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel. And let's put these in the time frame a little bit. King David is about 1000 BC. And the division of the kingdom occurs about 930 BC. It's about 200 years later, at about 721 BC, that the northern kingdom will be destroyed. That is the time of the prophet Isaiah. And so Isaiah is there around 700, just before 700 BC. He's around at 700 BC. And the other three prophets are all between 600 BC and about 550 BC. But the book of Isaiah occurs during the time of the fall of Israel and the Assyrian invasion. Isaiah is a prophet during the reign of Uzziah. He reigns 52 years. Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. And he prophesies down into the reign of Manasseh. Tradition tells us that Manasseh put him into a hollow log and then is going to saw the log in two. Isaiah is a contemporary of the northern prophets of Hosea, Amos, and he is also contemporary of the prophet Micah, who is a prophet in Judah. Isaiah basically his message is to the southern kingdom of Judah. In fact, all of your major prophets will be to Judah, because after Isaiah, the northern kingdom ceases to exist. The book of Isaiah is divided into two sections, the first 39 chapters and the second 27. Of course, our Bible is divided into two sections, the first 39 chapters and then the second section of 27 chapters, just like the Bible. The first 39 chapters are about messages of warning to Judah and the nations around them. And the second section of 27 chapters contain messages of hope, promising salvation and restoration. Some of the key passages and key things about the book of Isaiah. Everyone that reads Isaiah must be impressed with chapter 6, where it talks about Isaiah's call and his meeting with God in the temple. And when Isaiah saw God, he saw himself. And when he confessed his need, God met his need. And after his need was met, then he heard the call of God, whom shall I send, and who will go for me? And Isaiah will volunteer and say, Lord, here am I. Send me. Isaiah will be the prophet who predicts the destruction of the Assyrian army to King Hezekiah, and that army is destroyed. He also will be the prophet who prophesies to Hezekiah that God will heal him, give him 15 more years, and that the sun will go backward as a sign. Isaiah is a great prophet about the Messiah. He prophesies that Christ will be born of a virgin and that he would be God in the flesh. And then there is a great passage about the suffering servant in Isaiah chapter 53. And I think of a great passage there which just simply says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord hath placed on him the iniquity of us all. And I think of the passage in Isaiah 55, Ho, to everyone that is thirsty, let him come into the waters. Well, let's move on. And many of the great promises in Isaiah are quoted repeatedly. But let's go on to the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a prophet around 600 BC, and he prophesies for many years as Judah is gradually overcome by the Babylonians and destroyed. Jeremiah will spend his life trying and failing to win Judah back to God. Sometimes he's called the weeping prophet. And one of the other books in the major prophets is the book of Lamentations, or the Lamentation of Jeremiah, which talks about his cry to God for his country. Both he and Isaiah are from the upper classes, and they live in the palaces and deal with kings. Jeremiah will give us many stories about his own personal life in witnessing to the country. More than any other, he gives us a personal story. He is imprisoned several times. Once they drop him down into an empty cistern or well, where it says that he sank into the mire. But in the middle of predicting the eventual success of the Babylonians, which the people that are opposing him point out that he is discouraging the people from fighting the Babylonians, which in one sense that is true, as he encourages the nation to surrender and that the Babylonians would have mercy. But in the midst of the despair and destruction, Jeremiah predicts that Israel will return and that there will be a restoration. In fact, he goes and buys property to predict that. One great passage in Jeremiah looks ahead to the new covenant, when he says God's law will be placed in our inward parts and our hearts. And later on, the book of Hebrews will tell us that God will write his law in our minds, and in our hearts he will write them. So Jeremiah is a great prophet, prophesying about the captivity as the country collapses toward being carried away. Ezekiel will begin his prophecy about 592 with a number of people that have been carried away as exiles to the river Chebar in Babylon. Ezekiel sees himself as a watchman that stands on the wall to warn the people when he sees the enemy coming. The book of Ezekiel emphasizes personal responsibility for sin, and he states that the soul that sinneth, it shall die. It's not going to be punished for the sins of the father, but a person will be punished for their own personal sin. I do find it very interesting that Ezekiel does not even mention the concept of unintentional sins, nor does he give the idea that all people are sinning, but that we have the capability of choosing not to sin, and if we sin, we will pay the price for that sin. He promises that God in the new covenant will take away the stony heart and will give us an heart of flesh. In the valley of dry bones, in chapter 37, Ezekiel is carried away to the valley which is full of bones. And God asks him this statement, can these bones live? Now Ezekiel's answer is an answer like I would give. And he said, Lord, thou knowest. In other words, Ezekiel wanted to say, no, can't happen. It's an impossibility. It'll never be. But he knew God might have plans. And he said, well, Lord, that's up to you. You know, I don't. And Ezekiel is going to promise a restoration of the nation of Israel. Today, in modern times, Israel is the most powerful nation in the Middle East. There is no nation that has the military capability in that area of taking on the nation of Israel. Even though it is a small group of people, those dry bones have come together. And once again, they have stood upon their feet and have become a mighty army. And one of the great prophecies of Ezekiel, the last one I want to mention, is out of near the end of the book. Ezekiel takes a look at the temple, And he sees flowing out from under the altar and then under the temple a small stream of water. And he said, if you go down a little further, and you'll find that it was a little bit deeper, up to the ankles and up to the knees and up to the waist, and then it was rivers to swim in, and then it was a mighty river which you could not cross over. And it was a picture of the gospel, how the gospel began as just a little tiny thing, but it has grown and it has expanded, and now it has gone to the entire world. And the last of the great major prophets is a man who did not write a lot. His prophecy may not be any longer than some of the minor prophets, but Daniel was a very outsized person in reality. Daniel is going to prophesy through the entire captivity, all 70 years. Or he's going to talk about almost the entirety of the 70 years. He is going to be in the city of Babylon, and later on at the Persian capital. And one of the great passages in Daniel is in Daniel 1:8, where Daniel makes the statement, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. So as a young man, Daniel determined and made up his mind that he was going to serve God. Younger than probably any of the college students we have today, but he had settled the direction that he was going to go. And if you go from that point to the end of the book, almost 70 years later, as an old man, probably in his 80s, Daniel is taken before the king and asked to not pray. And when he does, he's taken and thrown in the lion's den. And throughout that entire lifetime, Daniel has stayed consistent and steady and was a solid man of God that entire time. Daniel is going to be known for interpreting dreams. The king will have a dream. He will interpret that dream. And that dream, that first one was about a statue of gold and of silver and of brass and of iron and clay. And Daniel is going to tell Nebuchadnezzar, thou art that head of gold. Later, Nebuchadnezzar is going to build a statue, all of gold. He's going to demand that everybody bow to it. When 3 young Israelites, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refuse, they're thrown into the fiery furnace. And that is one of the greatest stories we know of the Old Testament. How that in the middle of a fiery furnace, God steps in, and as Nebuchadnezzar looks into the middle of the furnace, he finds there's not 3 men that he cast in, but there's 4 men. And the 4th one looks like the Son of God. Daniel will interpret other dreams for the king. The Babylonian kingdom will disappear. And in the process of disappearing, Daniel will interpret for Belshazzar the writing on the wall. The Persians come into power in the beginning of the Persian Empire, and there Daniel is elevated to one of the highest positions in the government, but it causes a lot of jealousy, and they have a plot, and they say that no one can pray to anybody or any god except to the king. But Daniel continues to pray to God, and he is thrown into the lion's den. And we know the story. God delivered Daniel, and the men that accused him, they were thrown in, and they were devoured in a moment. God can and God does rescue his people. The last 6 chapters of the book of Daniel are various prophecies about the future. And he talks about what's going to be happening to Israel. He predicts a time frame, a year for the coming of the Messiah, which fits the time of Jesus Christ. And he also does some talking about the end times, such as the prophecy that says at the time of the end that people will run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. And today we see both of those things happening. So anyway, those are the major prophets that we have for the nation of Israel and how they fit in. We have Isaiah at the time of the fall of Israel and the Assyrians. That's at 700 BC. Then between 600 and 550 BC, We have three great prophets: Jeremiah prophesying with the people in Jerusalem as the nation falls toward captivity, Ezekiel prophesying among the captives that had been taken over to Babylon in the river at the river Chebar, and Daniel, who is taken and ends up being a ruler in the Babylonian kingdom and then in the Persian kingdom. All right, thank you.